This is the Influencer Entrepreneurs Podcast with Jenny Melrose, where I strategize with business owners on how to grow and scale their businesses to hit their income goals. This is episode 361 of the Influencer Entrepreneurs Podcast with Jenny Melrose. Today, we're going to be talking about mastering the art of podcast editing. We're going to have tips and techniques for a professional sound with Darrell Darnell of Pro Podcast Solutions. Darrell is actually the owner of the company that does my editing, and I'm super excited to have him. He was also a sponsor of Influencer Entrepreneurs Virtual Academy. And we are thrilled to have him on for this podcast. And the reason that we're talking about podcast editing is because you constantly probably hear me talking about the fact that you have to get in front of your audience in a new way. And podcasting is one of the easiest and best ways to do it because you don't have to get all dolled up to get in front of video to put content out where people can connect with you. Instead, it's just your voice. And when I say just your voice, that's actually more than just what it is. Because think about having my voice in your ears once a week, all the time, where you can binge my content and go back and get all the information and solve the problems for you. That's why we're talking about podcasting. So this episode is really going to talk about how you can do your own podcast editing and potentially outsource it as you start to get larger and have the ability and the investment to do that. All right, let's dive in. Hi, Darrell. How are you? Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. I'm doing great. It's so good to see you again.
Yes, you too. I am so excited to have this conversation about really getting tips and techniques for a professional sound when it comes to podcast editing. Before we jump into that, though, will you introduce yourself and your business to my audience?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thanks. So I'm Darrell Darnell. I'm the owner of Pro Podcast Solutions, and we are a company that is devoted to helping people like yourself start a podcast, or if they've already started a podcast and they're in that grind of editing and publishing and writing show notes or whatever those things are that they hate. We do that for folks too. So we kind of lift that burden off their shoulders. And so started in 2014, editing podcasts for others, or technically 13 is when I started. 14 is when I formed Pro Podcast Solutions, and been doing it ever since. Just love doing it.
Excellent. Yes, we're giggling beforehand because I started to, of course, tell you not to worry if there's any sound because I have people that do that. And I started giggling because, of course, it's you that does that for me.
Well, technically, it's Chris that edits this podcast. He's one of our great editors that we have on staff. So, hey, Chris, thanks for making this sound so good.
Perfect. All right. So let's start off with what software do I need to edit my podcast? If I were to try to do this on my own, what should I be using?
There's not a whole lot of places you can go wrong here. If there's a piece of software that's dedicated to audio editing, it's probably going to be a good tool. But the ones that we use Adobe Audition exclusively at Pro Podcast Solutions. When I started, I used a program called Audacity. And technically, when I started editing my own podcast, which was back in 2008 when I started podcasting, I used Audacity. It's a free audio editing program. It's available for Mac or Windows or even you Linux weirdos out there. And I say that affectionately, of course. But then it took me all weekend to edit my podcast. And I knew that people were doing podcasting on the Mac and they had this thing called GarageBand. And so pretty soon I switched to be a Mac guy so that I could get my hands on GarageBand. And I realized that software was even worse for editing because of the technicalities of how you splice audio together. And so I moved back to Audacity. So that's why I say there's pretty much nowhere. I would avoid GarageBand for the same reasons I avoided it back in the day, but Audition is good. Audacity is good. We've got some folks in Logic and different things like that. Those are all good. Hindenburg is really good. It's a piece of software that's designed for podcast editing. And so most people use Audition or Audacity, but there are a few other folks that use other things. And so they're all good.
Audacity is actually what I use to record in. That is, if I'm doing a solo episode, that's what I am in. It was what I tried to edit my first podcast in, and it took me 8 hours. And I turned around and said, nope, let's hire someone. And that's how I found you.
Yeah.
But Audacity is still what I use to this day to actually record my episodes. And then, of course, that's the raw feed that I send to you all that you always fix up and make sound real nice.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really good piece of software. It's come a long way in the last few years. Some folks didn't like it because it's getting a little technical here, but it would be destructive, which means if you make an edit, you delete something, you have to, let's say, then you do 3 or 4 other things. You have to undo, and then get to that thing that you deleted because it was a destructive style editor. And now it's not. They fixed that a couple of years ago, and now it's a non-destructive editor like Adobe Audition. So there's really no reason not to use it. It's a great piece of software. Doesn't have all the feature set that something like Adobe Audition would have, but there's no reason for me not to recommend Audacity. It's a great piece of software.
Perfect. So what are some of the common mistakes to avoid when editing a podcast?
Well, some of the mistakes that I hear folks making are the way they handle breaths or the way they make cuts. And so let's say you say something, and for example, when we started chatting today, I said, it's great to see you again, because you and I are seeing each other on Zoom, but I should have said it's great to talk with you again. So maybe I want to edit that out, right? And so when you're editing that out, be careful of the way you're doing it. You can edit in the middle of words in such a way that it makes it obvious that an edit has taken place. And my philosophy has always been, make an edit invisible or don't make it at all. I've always felt like if you make an edit and it's obvious that an edit was made, then you're risking your audience being taken out of the moment and wondering, what was just edited there? What was that? Did I hear an edit? And for a moment, their mind wanders and they lose you for just a second before they regain focus in on the episode. So if you are going to make an edit like the one I just mentioned, and Chris, leave that in, please. Use like a fader. I call it digital sandpaper. So make sure anytime you make an edit, you're just using a little bit of a fader. Every audio editing tool has some sort of fading ability. And on the front side and the back side of an edit, always use a little bit of a fade. That'll get rid of a pop sound that you might hear. If you're ever listening to a podcast and you hear a pop just in the middle of a word, odds are an edit was made there. So use that fader as kind of a digital sandpaper just to round off that edge and make it nicer. I mentioned breaths earlier. That's another one where I hear people, they'll make an edit they'll edit 2 words too close together, and it's like the breath doesn't finish and then they're into the next word. And the reason they did that, or you hear it that way, is they cut trying to trim it up or tighten it up a little bit. And that's good. But make sure you're using that fader on that breath to make that breath kind of fade out before the next word comes in, because otherwise it doesn't sound natural. And you want to make sure your editing is retaining the natural flow and sound of dialogue. Otherwise, people are going to know that there was something that was just not right about it.
When you use the fader, does it have to be in there for a certain amount of time, or is it kind of like almost like a cut that kind of goes in and just naturally fades it in like that? How does that tool work?
On a fader like that, you're looking at like 1/10 of a second or something like that. It doesn't need to be a long fade. You're not fading out music that needs to just kind of drift away kind of invisibly. You're talking about just, I love the phrase digital sandpaper, where you're just kind of roughing off the edge or smoothing off the rough edge rather. And so it's like 1/10 of a second or something like that. It can be longer, maybe 2/10 of a second, but it's not anything long.
Okay. No, that makes a ton of sense. What would you say is the ideal length for a podcast episode?
We get this question a lot. Like almost every discovery we do with a prospective client, this comes up almost every single time. And the answer is there is no answer. You look at guys like Joe Rogan, who has one of the most popular podcasts on the planet. His are over 2 hours long. You have some other podcasts that are really popular that are less than 15 minutes long. Mm-hmm. I think the thing to keep in mind is, how long does it need to be? and don't make it any longer or shorter than that. Don't worry about cutting out content so that you can make it short. Oh, my podcast needs to be 20 minutes or less. I'm going to have to cut out this thing that's really good. Don't do that. Leave it in. It's okay if it's 25 minutes because you left that one question in there. My podcasts are 45 minutes and we wrapped up at 30. Let me do an extra long intro, or let me, I don't know, drag it out in some way. Don't do that either. So just make it as long as the content is good. That's as long as it needs to be. I would say it's nice to be consistent with your podcast episodes so that your audience can, because your audience is going to work your podcast into the rhythm of their lives. And what I mean by that is maybe they're listening to your podcast every Tuesday during their commute or while they're at the gym or whatever. They're going to figure out where the rhythm of their lives fits. Your podcast fits into that. And so if you're pretty consistent with your length, then that helps them plan accordingly. And as a podcast listener, I always liked that. Maybe I'm a little OCD about time management and stuff like that too, but I would try to stay pretty consistent, but don't feel locked into it. If you've got a shorter episode or a longer episode because the content warrants that, then go with that.
Yes, I would definitely agree with the consistency piece. And I think also consistent as far as when the podcast episodes are published, because it gives people an opportunity to know, okay, Monday morning, I know this podcast is going to drop. I know I can listen to it after 5 a.m. when it comes out or whatever it might be. But yes, consistency is so huge for your audience for sure.
Absolutely. Big deal. Yep.
What would you say? How do you ensure that the podcast audio is actually balanced and consistent? Is there something that we should be doing on our end, like within our homes when we're going to actually record, or even through the editing piece?
Yeah, I mean, a good editing company, if you hire an editing company, they're going to be able to level and make sure everything is good. But there are some things that whether you're editing on your own or you just want to make sure you're doing your best to hand off a rough product to get cleaned up to an editor, always recording in the same environment every time will give you consistency in your sound. Bringing the microphone up close to your mouth. My microphone right now, I've got it really close today because my room is in the middle of being painted and my room is pretty echoey, extra echoey today. So I've got my mic right on my mouth to try to mitigate as much of that echo as possible. But with any good microphone, you want to get a dynamic microphone, not a condenser. Get it right up next to your mouth, 2 inches, 4 inches away from your mouth. And so be consistent with your microphone placement, be consistent with how you're recording in your environment as much as possible. And so that's going to help with that consistent sound. If you're talking into a laptop with no other microphone other than the one that's built into it, that's going to be very difficult to get really good quality sound out of something like that. So invest in a microphone, invest in a dynamic microphone. You can get a good one for $100. You can get a really good one for $800, but you don't have to spend $800 to sound professional. You can spend $100 and sound professional. So get a good microphone, get it up to your mouth, and then record in the same way every week or however often you're doing episodes. You can use some third-party tools as well. I think you asked me about being balanced and stuff like that. So part of when I hear the word balanced, part of that is how balanced is my voice with that of my guest, and making sure that those are the same. There are plugins that are available for this. One that I use and I love is by a company called Waves, and it's called Vocal Writer.
Okay.
And imagine you had like an audio technician just riding that volume rocker as people are talking to make sure that it's always at the same, the output's always at the same level. That's what that plugin is doing. It's called Vocal Writer, RIDER, and by Waves. Or if you just want to kind of drag and drop your audio into a processing software that will just kind of level it out for you, there's a great online tool for this called Auphonic, AUPHONIC, auphonic.com. And it literally is, you just drag your audio file in there and it does some really nice cleanup and leveling and stuff like that. So using tools like that can help make sure everything's balanced as well.
Would you also recommend, or have you heard of the Chrome extension Crisp? Do you think that works? Is that something that should be added potentially?
I'm not familiar with that. I'm not sure.
Okay. All right. Somehow that came across. I don't know if it was an email or who exactly it came from. But that was like a Chrome extension that I have always going in the background. I don't know if it makes that much of a difference or not, but it's another one that's out there for sure. What is actual process for editing a podcast from start to finish?
Okay. Start to finish. Well, so this is after you've recorded everything. And so you're going to take those audio files that exist somewhere. They're going to exist on your audio recorder. Maybe they're going to exist on your hard drive, maybe on an online tool like Riverside or Zoom or Squadcast or something like that. You're going to pull those into your audio editing software. So we talked about Audition or Audacity or whatever, just drag those in. We recommend, if you can, record each participant on a separate track. If you can, that way you can kind of dial in the EQing and the background noise and stuff specific to each person on the recording. We also recommend setting up a template of some sort. So maybe this kind of goes back into your previous question about consistency. One of the things you can do to be consistent is to set up a template for your podcast, whether pretty much any audio editing software will allow you to kind of save a template. And so what that means is you've got a track that's your intro. You've got a track that's your music. You've got a track that's you. And then you've got a track that's your guest. And so you can take your music and your intro and those are going to be the same every week, right? We just talked about making sure you're recording in the same way, in the same room, with your mic in the same placement every week. So you should be really consistent with you. You can set those settings, whatever you want, with EQing or voice leveling and that sort of thing. Save it in your template. And then you really don't have to do too much to that from week to week. You want to give it a good listen, make sure you're good. But that should be pretty much set it and forget it. And then you've got your guest track. And so you may have to tweak that from week to week, depending on what kind of microphone they have or what kind of environment they're in. Are they a male voice or a female voice? Those are some things that can cause you to tweak the EQing or some things like that. But either way, bring it into your audio editor, lay everything out, and then you're just going to listen through it. And the style of editing or how aggressive you are with editing is going to kind of depend on your philosophy. We offer two styles of editing, and it really comes down to a philosophical choice in most cases. Do you want filler words and crutch phrases removed, ums and ahs and like and and stammering, those sorts of things? If you want those removed, then it's a very surgical, slow process of getting those removed, getting that fader or digital sandpaper we talked about, making sure the breaths sound right. It's a tedious process, but that's the process of just going through it. If you are pretty well spoken or you don't care if that stuff is left in there, then the editing process can be a little bit more quick. Maybe you want to be listening also for any rabbit trails that need to be gotten rid of or those sorts of things. So it's really just listening through and figuring out what needs to be edited out or not. One thing you can do to speed up that process, because you talked about it, like your first one was 8 hours. I said my first one took me a whole weekend. You'll get faster over time, but it is a lengthy process. And so one thing that I recommend is setting up keyboard shortcuts. And so what are the things that you're going to be using consistently throughout the editing process? What is it like? Cut, copy, maybe paste, zoom in, zoom out, play, stop, undo. Those are types of things that even if you haven't edited audio, some of those sound like maybe something I would use in Microsoft Word. Those commands sound kind of familiar, and the keyboard shortcuts are pretty similar. If I want to cut something, it's Command X, right? Just like it would be in Word. It's the same thing in most audio editors. And then some audio editing softwares allow you to even change those shortcut keys to be something else. And so what I do is I make sure all the ones I'm using the most often are on the left-hand side of my keyboard, because I'm right-handed. So my mouse is using my right hand's using my mouse. And so I'll make them single keystroke on the left-hand side of my keyboard. So zoom in is 1, zoom out is 2, cut is X instead of Command X. And so doing those things can speed up the process, getting them over to your left hand. So my right hand stays on my mouse, my left hand stays on my keyboard. And as I'm listening, my hands are doing all the work. And so I don't have to be inefficient with moving my hand over or doing two-stroke keyboard shortcuts and that sort of thing. So just taking time to set up your workspace and getting familiar with the software. It's a painstaking process. When I switched from Audacity to Audition, it was painful because I was more efficient in Audacity. I'd been using it. I knew how to use it. But whichever software you're using, it's going to take some time to get used to it, just like anything else. And then you'll get there. And so it's just listening through it, cutting out the stuff that you don't want, and then, aligning your music and your intro and outro so that they're fading in at the right times and at the same level. And we talked about how to do leveling and stuff already. So once you do that, you export it. You want to export it as an MP3. Stereo 128 kilobits per second is pretty good. You can go mono if you want. If it's just a spoken word podcast, mono is just fine. For a lot of our clients, we'll do mono 80 kilobits per second, and then it's uploading it to your media host of choice. Libsyn is a really popular one. We like Red Circle a lot as well, or Podbean or Blueberry. Those are some of the more popular ones. There's a lot of great ones out there. It's uploading it to your media host, and then from there it gets sent out to the podcast directories.
Yes. No, I personally use Buzzsprout as my hosting, but like you said, there's so many options out there, and they're a low monthly fee, just like it would be for hosting a website or hosting a blog, and go from there. And it's funny that you said about the 8 hours. The hilarious part of it is that I wasn't even trying to get the ums or anything like that out. I was only trying to bring in the music, the intro and the outro, and that was it. And it was a solo episode. There wasn't another person for me to try to balance it. So it was definitely a learning curve, but it can get quicker, or it can get even faster if you hand it off to someone like Pro Podcast that can actually take that under their wing and do that for you to outsource it. What would you say, Darrell? If I needed to improve the quality of my podcast editing, what would you recommend I do?
Improving the recording itself or the editing piece of it?
The actual editing piece of it. So if I wanted to improve that quality, is there something in particular that I should be using in order to do that? Other than editing software, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, besides the things that we talked about, nothing really springs to mind. Those keyboard shortcuts are really important. That's something I've been teaching editors to do for almost 10 years now. And it's one of the things that I hear people comment most on, that the digital sandpaper, I get comments on that. Oh, that's, I love that piece of it. And the keyboard shortcuts. Those are the two things that I get folks commenting back to me on, or coming out to me at a conference. A year later, I sat in on your session and, oh my gosh, those, so those are really important. Taking time to learn those keyboard shortcuts or make your own keyboard shortcuts. Using Auphonic or some sort of leveling device is really going to be important. The other thing I guess to add to it that's coming to mind are other plugins. I mentioned the vocal writer. If you're going to do your editing yourself and you want to invest in some software or some plugins to help you do that, a plugin is just some software is going to come with a plugin, like a noise remover or an EQ or something like that. But then you can also buy third-party plugins that are more powerful and do other things that are specific to what you need. There's a ton of for musicians or music production, but we're talking about podcasting here. And so there's some wonderful plugins by Isotope, T-O-P-E, called RX. And I think they're on version 9 right now, RX9 maybe. And so they have a different plugin pack that you can get that's like a declip, a declick, a denoise, a de-reverb. Those are amazing. When I invested in those, and they're not cheap, but if you want to invest in those, they're worth it for sure. They'll make your editing process, your mastering process, I should say, much more efficient, and they're just wonderful. So that's something that you could look into if you really want to commit into doing audio editing.
Yes, the templates, especially to me, just kind of resonated because I do feel like that's something we always talk about, make a template so that you can reuse it and be able to just kind of pop everything in. So the shortcuts, I appreciate that so much.
Mm-hmm.
Darrell, you actually offer a launch guide that can help podcasters that are starting to get started and actually launch their podcast. Can you tell us a little bit about what we can find in that? And we're going to make sure that we link to that to the show notes. And my listeners know they can always send me a DM on Instagram at Jenny_Melrose, and I'll send that directly to them. Just ask me for the launch guide for podcasting, but tell us a little bit about what's in it.
Yeah, it's a real simple PDF. It's two-sided or two-paged, and one side of it talks about audio quality, and the other side of it talks about things that a lot of new podcasters get tripped up on when they're launching their podcast. And so these are things like, how do you define success? And so this is a question often we ask folks when we are meeting with them on that discovery call. A year from now, thinking about where you want to be with your podcast, how are you going to determine if this first year was successful or not? How do you define success? And so that really helps them kind of, a lot of people are like, I don't know, I hadn't really thought about that. They're like, well, is it based on download numbers or is it based on sponsorships? Probably not year one. Those are probably not year one top goals. Maybe you want to have a goal, but it shouldn't be your top goal. What's your influence going to be? How many episodes do you want to? They can vary from podcaster to podcaster. We really leave this open-ended. But thinking about how you're going to define success a year from now, it becomes a nice little filter as you're making 1,000 decisions during that launch process. Filter it through that. This is what I'm looking for. This is how I'm going to define success a year from now. And as I'm making this decision, how does it square with that? So that's a really important piece. Talking about identifying who your listener is, who your audience is, niching it down is really, really important. The analogy I like to give there is there's a lot of podcasts that are targeted for women. That's great. That is not niche enough. Give me what's the next level of that? How am I going to niche that down? Okay, maybe I want to go to women who are mothers. That's good. That's still not good enough. I mean, there's a lot of podcasts out there designed for mothers. Give me something else. Okay, maybe single mothers. Okay, we're getting somewhere. Right. But I think we can do better. Well, how can we niche that down even further? Okay, maybe we want to go to military single moms, and maybe they're single moms because their husband was killed in combat or something like that. Okay, now we've got a very, very specific niche that we can really identify with, meet them where they're at, and create a great podcast that's specific to that really small niche. And the community that develops around that is going to be amazing. So you can see how just kind of taking that time to really identify who your niche is that you're speaking to is going to make your podcast all that better. So those are some of the things that are contained in the guide, really just trying to help people think through the process of getting ready for a podcast launch. We handle the technical piece of it if you want to hire us to do that. And there's some information on that as well, but that's where we kind of shine, is to come in and take care of that technical piece of it.
The fact that you asked that in the discovery call kind of brought me back. And of course, now I've been podcasting almost 6 years ago. So 6 years. So you asked me that question a very long time ago. But I have a feeling it's probably the reason that I am so consistent and have never missed a Monday in 6 years, because I think you asked me that question and I said, just wanted to get a podcast out each week. And that was my goal for success. And I've just stayed that course. So I appreciate that. And that can just show how valuable setting that realistic goal for yourself can be with this guide. So if you haven't, head over to the show notes. We will make sure that you grab that guide. And again, just send me a DM if you want to get that. Darrell, I appreciate you so much for taking the time to speak with me and my audience and being a sponsor for Influencer Entrepreneurs Academy Virtual Summit. It was fabulous having you there. And I just appreciate you so much.
Well, thanks. We love working with you. It's been awesome being a part of the summit and chatting with you today. We love helping podcasters, and we've just been the relationship that we've had working with you these last 6+ years has just been awesome. So thank you for that.
Of course. Thank you. All right, there you have it. Darrell gave away so many insider tips of how to do the podcast editing so that it can be beneficial and quicker for you, with everything from his templates to the rounding of the edges. I loved his sandpaper metaphor. It was so good. Really helped me understand how to get that podcast sound done the way that you need it. If you are looking to launch a potential podcast in the near future and you want his guide, please make sure that you grab it. You can send me a DM at Jenny_Mellors, or you can hop over to the show notes and download it there. He has so much, just a ton of information that is going to be able to help you. As always, I appreciate you guys so much when you leave a rating and review on the podcast. You can just scroll on down. You'll see where you see ratings and reviews. Leave me one sentence from your biggest takeaway from today and leave me a rating. All right, guys, until next time, I will see you all then.